Thank you. And I also thank you to everyone. Thanks for joining. And thank you to Jack for putting this together. He's very difficult to work with. That's my joke for the day. There's more coming, though. Okay. When the state of Israel was first established, people were amazed at the longevity of Yemenite Jews. There weren't accurate medical records from Yemen, but they were octogenarians in their 90s. People were wondering, do they have yogurt over there? And there's a story that one Yemenite Jew walked into a life insurance agency in Tel Aviv, said he wanted to take out life insurance policy. The clerk said, "I'm sorry, sir, but you're too old." He said, "That's not fair." "Why?" "You don't even know my age." "Okay, how old are you?" "I'm 73. "That's much too old for life insurance." He said, "That's not fair." "Why?" "My father came in last week. You sold him a policy." "Your father? How old is he?" 97 years old. "Can't be." "Check your records." Clerk went to the back of the shop. Sure enough, man came in, 97 years old, underwent a physical examination, which he passed. "We sold your father a policy. We'll sell you a policy. Come in next Tuesday afternoon between 3 and 5 in the afternoon. We will submit you to physical examination. If you pass, we'll be happy to sell you a policy." "I can't come in next Tuesday." "Why not?" "I have to go to a wedding." "A wedding? Who's getting married?" "My grandfather." Your grandfather. "How old is he?" "He's 121. 121? Why is he getting married?" "His parents keep insisting he's got to get married." Okay. So today, of course, we celebrate the birth of the state of Israel, which has no meaning unless we have a perspective. Otherwise, knowing, you know, I know, your community knows, where I'm coming from, we know that without a state of Israel, we were victims of persecution, prosecution, pogrom, every single evil that our neighbors had out for us. And that's why the Knesset passed a law that any Jew who comes to Israel automatically will become a citizen. Everyone the law has the rule of return. So I want to give a bit of a historical perspective. It says in Parashat Va'et Hanan, Moshe Rabbeinu was not privileged like us to enter the land of Israel. He can only stand Me'ever HaYarden on the eastern bank of the Jordan River and look over and see the land. And this is what it says in the Torah. Alei Rosh HaPisgah, ascend to the peak of the mountain. Sana Einech Orei, lift up your eyes and look. Yama Tzafon Semanu Mizracha, look to the west, to the north, to the south, and to the east. Urei ve'einecha, look with your eyes, because you will not transgress this Yarden. So my question is, simple geography. I don't know how to illustrate this for you, but he's sitting on the eastern bank of the Jordan. So if he looks to the west, he's looking at the breadth of the land of Israel. He looks to the north, he's looking at the Galil and the Golan. If he looks to the south, he's looking at the Negev. My question is, if he looks to the east, he's no longer looking at the land of Israel. What was God telling him to look at? So I thought of this answer. I travel a lot. Well, I say I travel a lot. I used to travel a lot. For 13 months, I haven't traveled. But I traveled so much, and if people wanted to be cruel to me unwittingly, they would put me, they would host me, they'd put me in the room with the books. I'm illiterate, but I'm always curious what other people are reading. And I came across the Boy Scout manual. I don't know if there's anyone here who's read that. The book is yay thick, fascinating. Okay, the part about folding flags and tying knots is kind of boring, but if you're ever lost in a forest, second to a cellular phone, this book is indispensable. And I read there, what happens if you're totally lost, you don't know where you are, and you come to one of these cross signs, it says Minsk, Pinsk, Vinsk, Schnitzelberg, and it's on the ground. How can the sign give you any help? Anyone? Gabriel? It's got to be Gabriel here, right? They're all muted. Okay. Okay, the answer is, you don't know where you are. The sign is on the ground, but you know where you came from. If you know where you came from, you can set the sign straight. And that way, and what I derive from this, if you know where you're coming from, it'll give you direction to where you're going to. We can't just simply walk into the land of Israel. So Moshe Rabbeinu, what does he see when he looks to the east? God said to Moshe, tell me, what do you see looking at the land of Israel? I see trees and grass and clouds. Moshe, what do you see? I see people and cattle and sheep. Moshe, what do you see? I see landscaping and terracing. Moshe, look over your shoulder. Look where you came from, the Memrivad, the strife, the anguish. You can't just simply enter the land of Israel. You need to have a perspective. Okay, there was a time when we did not have the right perspective, and that was in the time of the Meraglim, the spies that Moshe sent out to see the land of Israel. Vayivku balayla, they cried that night. That is the night of Tisha B'Av, and we've been crying ever since. Now, some of you may be aware of the fact that Eicha, Megillat Esther, which we read on Tisha B'Av, is an acrostic. Acrostic means it's alphabetical. Aleph, Bet, Vet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin. Ania Gever, the third chapter, is a double acrostic. Aleph, Aleph, Bet, Bet, Gimel, Gimel, Dalet, Dalet, Hey, Hey, Vav. And there are two verses that are inverted. And Chazal, Chachamim, have this beautiful interpretation. It's delicious pun. It should be Nun Samach Ayin Pei, but rather in Eicha it says Nun Samach Pei Ayin. Why did it invert the letters? Chazal said the sin of the Meraglim was they were makdim Pei Ayin, put Pei before the Ayin, put their mouths Pei before their eyes. Notice they wrote a report before they saw the land. I'll explain this with an analogy. Those of you in the audience like me, 27 years old, then you remember in Soviet Russia how no one ever left Russia, be it a weightlifter, a ballerina dancer, a lecturer, without a KGB escort, lest they like it too much abroad and forget to come back to Father Russia. So what happened was they discovered mummies in Egypt that were so old, it defied the ability of the Egyptian experts to date the mummies. So they called in experts from America. They came and they too, it was too old. They couldn't date the mummies. They called experts from Canada and from Scandinavia. In desperation, they turned to the Russians. So the Russians put together a team of scientists, and they went, of course, with a KGB escort, lest they forget to come back to Russia. They traveled down to Egypt and did the carbon dating and did all kinds of apparatus, and they couldn't. And they said to the KGB, "We're going back home now." He said, "How old are the mummies?" "We don't know." "What do you mean you don't know?" "We did all of our data, all of our dating. We couldn't figure it out." He said, "Give me 5 minutes, I'll tell you." So the KGB agent walks into the cave. He walks out 2 minutes later. I said, "I know his name. I know his address. I know his shoe size. I know what kind of ice cream he likes." "How do you know?" "Look, I got him to sign a confession." That's exactly what the Meraglim, they wrote the report before they put their mouth, Peh, before the ayin. And because they were makdim pel ayin, they didn't see the important part of Israel, which is the Einei Hashem, that God's eyes are always on the land. They said, Eretz ochelet yoshveha, a land which devours its inhabitants. Wherever they went, God did a favor. Instead of looking at these little spies, everybody was in the graveyard. There was a lot of burials. A land which devours yoshveha, those who sit. Mekubalim say, those who sit, that means you're static. Israel demands constant, dynamic, perpetual ascent, going higher. If you just vegetate, that'll work in Rome, that'll work in New York, that'll work in London. But in Israel, if you don't go up, you're going down. I want to give one more analogy, if I may. Tanchuma says, Rashi hints at this. It's just what I mean by perspective, how we look at Israel. Perspective is, when Abraham went to the Akedah, to the binding of Isaac, it was 4 people plus. It was Abraham, Isaac, the lads, Eliezer, Yishmael, and it was also the donkey. The verse says the donkey, I'll quote the donkey as well. So, and it was on the 3rd day, they're walking towards Har HaMoriah, to the place where today the Beit HaMikdash was built. It should be speedily rebuilt. And they're walking there, and the 3rd day from afar, Abraham says to Yitzchak, "My son, do you see what I see?" "Yes, my father, I see it." He then turned to the lads, "Do you see it?" They said, "No." How can it be 2 people could look at the same thing and not see the same thing? So I'm going to explain this with an analogy. You walk into a physics lab, and they have a Wilson cloud chamber, which is a smoky box of glass where electrons are shot through. I ask you, "What's this?" You think it's a smoky box of glass. I'm a physicist. I know it's a Wilson cloud chamber. Or I'll sing for you a little tune. Na 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 na. So what am I singing? You think it's a little melody at best, and I think it's Schubert's Unfinished Symphony. We both heard the same thing, yet we perceive different things. You heard a little melody. I heard Schubert's Unfinished, and it was on the 3rd day. And Avram looked out and he said, "My son, do you see what I see?" He said, "Yes, my father," for he perceived that those clouds on top of the mountain, that was the Shekhinah HaKadoshah, that was God's holy presence. Eliezer, Shmuel, do you see it? They saw scenery. You don't see it? You stay here with the donkey. He's myopic, you're myopic, you can't see. You stay here. And that's the way it is in life. The Ramban writes, when they came to Israel, some people, they saw little hills and they said, "Wow, Such beautiful mountains. In Spain, they had more beautiful mountains. People saw little valleys. They said, and other people said, how beautiful it is. It's a blessing to see the good in Israel. And that, we should do this for Yom Ha'atzmaut. Maybe you're familiar with this. People had the custom before Rosh Hashanah and the days preceding, everybody's saying Slichot. So they say people accept upon themselves to go 1 hour a day to refrain, to be free of Lashon Hara, not to gossip, not to slander. Did you ever hear of this? 1 hour a day not to speak Lashon Hara, like 3 to 4 in the morning. So let's make up on ourselves, at least for Yom Ha'atzmaut, 1 hour a day not to speak bad. We don't want to speak bad about the land, not the rocks, not anything. It's our holy land, and we have to have that special view to see the good in the land. So it's a perspective. Just like the lads didn't see the mountain, didn't see the clouds and God's presence. And that's the way it is. A carpenter comes into the room, he notices the woodwork. An electrician notices the electrical work. A CIA agent notices a bug. I also see a bug, I mean the electronic listening device. I'll tell you a story. We were wed in Israel, my wife and I. I'm originally from Vienna. And after the wedding, we were traveling back to America. We stopped in Vienna to meet relatives. And we're already in Vienna. I said, let's go to Czechoslovakia. It's just 100 kilometers away. Now, I'm so old. I'm 27 already. So why is that so funny? Anyway, so we go to Czechoslovakia, and it was a communist country. It was before the Iron Curtain came down. And we get into this hotel of sorts, and I'm looking for the bug, right? There has to be a listening device. I don't know what I'm looking for, but it has to be there. And I'm looking all over the place. We're newlyweds. My wife is not yet into my shtick. She doesn't know what I'm up to. And I'm about to abandon the search. And then, I see a bump on the floor, which arouses my suspicion. I lift up the rug. There's a nut which seems suspicious. I unscrew it, and I inspect it. It seems innocuous enough. About 4 minutes later, there's a very vigorous knock on the door from the woman from directly beneath us in the hotel room with part of a chandelier embedded in her head. Now, I don't know exactly what she was saying. She's talking Czech, but it was, I think, don't look for any more listening devices. Now, let me tell you a story of a little girl who had the right perspective. This is over 100 years ago. This is one of the great wonders of Jewish history. Herzl's right hand was Max Nordau, Professor Max Nordau. Now, why would Nordau get involved in building the Jewish state? Nordau was married to a non-Jewish woman, deeply involved in Viennese society, later Parisian society. Why Israel? And he writes the following in his diary. In Vienna, there's a Hasidic couple which had an only child, a 10-year-old girl, who was born lo aleinu with a rare congenital defect which had robbed her of a brain. The girl was 10 years old, and she was a very, very sick girl. In desperation, no one could diagnose the problem. In desperation, they went to the greatest diagnostician in the entire Austro-Hungarian Empire, Professor Max Nordau. They went to Dr. Nordau. He offered a diagnosis, which led to a prognosis, prescribed medication, which gave rise to a cure. 2 years later, the girl was fully recovered. And now the Hasidic couple comes back 2 years later with all the trappings, long coat, bulletproof stockings, a hat large enough to be a she'elah of Ohel and Shabbat. And he said to the doctor, he said, Herr Doctor, I'm not a wealthy man, but you never sent me a bill. But whatever you charge me, it'd be my pleasure to pay. You gave us back our daughter. Dr. Nordau said, I don't want any money. All I want is this lovely girl should give me a kiss. And she said, she's 12 years old. Parents turned crimson red. She's 12 years old. She can't kiss a strange man. She went to Sha'arei, what's it called? What are the girls' schools? Sha'arei Torah. She can't kiss a strange man. She's 12 years old. He said, okay, little girl, tell me, what did you learn in school today? Today in school, we learned the story how Yaakov was traveling along the way, B'derech Ephrata, and Rachel died, Rachel died. Instead of burying her in Hebron with other avotim, with other forefathers and foremothers, he buried her there along the way in Derech Beit Lechem, Derech Ephrata, so that she could offer solace and comfort as we went off to the exile. And there's a reward for all your efforts. V'shavu vanim ligvulam. And your children, they will return to their borders. You heard these words said, Maidala, little girl. Do you honestly and truly believe after close to 2,000 years of exile Indeed, the Jews will return to the land. She put her hand on her heart. Of course I believe it, for it says so in my Torah. At that moment, Nordo understood indeed they would return and pledged the rest of his life to building the Jewish state. A more contemporaneous story I learned in the Mir Yeshiva, I still do, in the Rosh Yeshiva, the very sainted Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Chaim Shmulevitz. He used to tell us not to go to the Kotel, to the Western Wall, more than once a month. But he was afraid. If we go all the time, then it will lose its sacred nature and we'll take it for granted. So my Chavruta asked Rav Chaim Shmulevitz, he said, Rosh Yeshiva, you tell us to go only once a month, and yet the Rosh Yeshiva goes all the time. And Rav Chaim Shmulevitz answered, I know. I can't control myself. I think that's the proper perspective. In the heart, in the head to know once a month, but in the heart not to be able to control yourself. That should be the love we have for our land. Now, it is our heritage, and for sacredness to be sensed anywhere, it must be sensed somewhere, and that somewhere is the land of Israel. As the song goes, L'chol shirayich ani chinor. I can't get those notes. L'chol shirayich. So these are the words of Yehuda Levi. I'm the fiddle, I'm the violin for all your songs. So all those who laid claim to Israel, Titus, Godfrey Boyan, the Crusader, Saladin, the Marauder, they all laid claim to Israel and to Jerusalem, but their descendants never mourned for it, nor did they fast for it. When the Moors were driven out of Spain, they left the land for good. When we were driven out of the land of Israel, it never left from within our hearts. We are privileged to go to Israel. We're like the butlers in God's palace. The land didn't leave from within our hearts. It seems rather evident that those who look out for the land of Israel, we spoke earlier, not to accept upon ourselves, to make a commitment, to make, reminds me of a story. There was this religious woman who made a commitment to go on a diet, not tomorrow, but today. And no sooner had she made the commitment to go on a diet and she was driving down the road past the bakery, and there was Napoleon, a custard cake, oozing custards. And no, she said, it must be Mina Shamayim, I have to eat this Danish. But then again, I did make this commitment to go on a diet, but then again, God did arrange this fortuitous encounter between the eclair and myself. I know, I'll wait for a sign from above. I know, if I find a parking space in front of the bakery, then I will know it's meant for me to eat the eclair. And sure enough, on her 14th time around the block, she found a parking space in front of the bakery. If you look out for Israel, then maybe Israel will look out for you. I mentioned before, I learned in the Mir Yeshiva, Reb Chaim Shmulevitz was the Rosh Yeshiva. His father-in-law, the founding Rosh Yeshiva, Eliezer Yehuda Finkel, lived in Mir, which is a town in Poland. It's not just down Ocean Parkway. Am I got that right? Avenue RS, it's in your neighborhood. It's in the hood. So a fellow went to Israel from Mir, long, you're talking about 130 years ago. He came back, he said, tell me, because Eliezer loved the land of Israel. What did you see there? And he related, over there they eat animal fodder, animal food. Because in Europe, in Lithuania, they did not eat salads. In Israel, they eat salads. He said, they eat animal fodder. And he was so upset. This person had a chance to speak good about Israel. He said, they eat animal food. And not more than 2 weeks had lapsed, and this person had some dietary problem. The doctor said, all he can eat was salad. The land looks out for those who look out for you. And by the way, if you're interested in the history of Israel, here's an unabashed plug. We started a podcast just maybe 5-6 weeks ago about the early struggle for the birth of Israel, called Teller, my name, Teller from Jerusalem. And there, every week we tell another episode about how the land was built, about these unsung heroes who did so much to enable us to come to the land of Israel. I'm enamored by these examples. I want to give, if not 3, I'll give at least 1. I assume you're familiar with the Balfour Declaration. When it happened in 1917, there was rejoicing throughout the Jewish world. In Kishinev, in Odessa, 200,000 Jews went onto the streets. The non-Jews had never seen such a thing. They were throwing out from airplanes. And the Balfour, the foreign minister in England, was getting telegrams from Jewish communities in Hong Kong, in Shanghai, in Cape Town, South Africa, all over the world. Congratulations. It didn't have to work out the way. It's very, very much like the story of Megillat Esther and Purim. It was a miracle that no one could have ever understood. For example, what happened was in 1917, Balfour, credited with the declaration, he was not a person who had great love of Jews. His fear was more Jews would come to England because America was taking these waves of immigrants from Russia, escaping from the pogroms, state-sponsored terrorism. And he's afraid that if America closes its doors, they'll come to England. And England didn't want poor surplus Jews. So he himself drafted the Alien Bill. And then again, this is the very same person. What's going to change? A lot of things happen, and we'll see how they converge together. In 1917, well, before that actually, World War I, I don't know if you know this, I'm a teacher. I've taught many young ladies from the community. I teach in seminaries in Israel. And when I teach, I say things which are humorous, but to entertain myself, I say something which is even funnier. So it just occurred to me something which I'm going to share with you because I really think it is funny. I realized that if they would have called it World War I at the time, it would have been so depressing. Hence, they called it the Great War. Okay, we can go further. Okay, World War I, a critical ingredient for war materiel is acetone. Acetone is not just necessary for nail polish remover, it's critical for explosives. And England couldn't get it because they had imported their acetone from Germany. Now Germany's the enemy. Germany's not going to supply it. England could not get it from America because of the U-boats, which were bombing ships. So they needed, and there was a chemist in Manchester, a Jewish chemist. Anybody want to guess what his name was?
Chaim Weizmann.
Good for you. Very good. Dr. Chaim Weizmann. And what was he doing there? A good question. Anyways, Chaim Weizmann was in Manchester, and the young Lord of the Admiralty, a young person, came to him. His name was Winston Churchill. Young Winnie said, Dr. Weizmann, we need 90,000 tons of acetone. Instead of fainting, Weizmann said, I'll work on it. And he figured out how to make artificial acetone by fermenting chestnuts. They took over all the breweries, and then he became the head of the Naval Military Science, and the Minister of Munitions was David Lloyd George, who was later going to become the Prime Minister at the time that the Balfour Declaration is issued. So he was in the right place at the right time, made the right miracle. The British was the right team. Her Majesty's government favors the establishment, that's the Balfour Declaration, a homeland in Israel for the Jews. What else was going on over there? Rav Kook was in Israel. He traveled to Switzerland to speak at a Agudah conference to try and convince them to be more pro-Israel. World War I broke out. He traveled to England. There were members of the parliament that were Jewish that were not in favor of recognizing Palestine as a Jewish home. That's always the problem of Jewish people who try to accommodate the non-Jews too much. So Rav Kook wrote a letter. He said, I'm going to explain to you what Jewish law is all about. And what he wrote was published and distributed. He also played a role in what was going on there. And there's a fellow named Aaron Aronson. Aaron Aronson realized that Israel will never become a Jewish state as long as the Turks are there. The Turks were cruel, torturous. They hanged Jews, they starved Jews, they expelled Jews. So he created a spy ring with his family, and they'd send information to the British. And because of that, the British had their information. He was in England at the same time. All these things coalescing enabled the Balfour Declaration until the execrable white paper which forbade Jewish immigration at that critical time. Thank God now we have a state. No one's going to tell us when we can open our borders, when we can close our borders. That's for us to decide. Okay, one other person, an interesting story. Oh boy, time's almost up. One other person is Harry Truman, the President of the United States, was the first to recognize the state of Israel. How did that happen? George Marshall, his Secretary of State, was not friendly to Jews. He was very much against recognizing Israel. He said Israel will never survive a war against the Arabs. They're much larger and stronger. But Harry Truman had a business partner. He was involved in haberdashery. We call that in Syrian community shmatas, right? Shmatas, okay. So They went bankrupt. As a rule, when partners go bankrupt, they don't remain friends, but they were friendly. Chaim Weizmann came to America to speak to the president. All the president's aides said, you will not speak with him. Eddie Jacobson came into the White House through the side entrance and went straight to the president. And he saw on the president's desk, they were partners, they were friendly. There was a bust of Andrew Jackson. And he said, Mr. President, you have your hero, I have my hero. Your hero is Andrew Jackson, my hero is Chaim Weizmann. As Abi Eben wrote, never has there been a worse analogy in history. But he said, you have to meet him. And then Harry Truman turned around in his swivel chair, looked out the window, said, okay, you bald son of a gun, I'll do it. He met with Chaim Weizmann and he promised they'll be the first to recognize him. Within 11 minutes of Israel declaring Machriz Bazed on this date, the 5th of Iyar, which we're commemorating today, 11 minutes later, Harry Truman kept his promise and America recognized the state of Israel. The last thing I want to tell you is we all are aware of the fact that the way we get to Yom Ha'atzmaut is through Yom HaZikaron. I would call this bittersweet chocolate. There was people who gave their lives. We have a brave army that fights on our behalf. And if I may, I'll conclude with one story. There was a fellow who worked in a mashpir, which is a department store, who has, this is going back many years. I'm in Israel many years. I'm 27 years old, but I'm in Israel already most of my life, about 45 years. And this man was so intelligent. He had 3 different doctorates in 3 different disciplines. Very, very intelligent person. And I would go, he worked at the clock, at the watch counter in Hamashbir. And I would talk to him about everything, because he knew everything. So Shmulik escaped. Shmulik, this is the fellow's name, Shmulik. He came to Israel after the war, having lost his wife, having lost his family. He had nothing. And then a year and a half later, his son Yossi, who he thought was left in the ash can of Poland, also washed up on the shores of Israel. And he got reunited with his father. Their joy knew no bounds. Finally, father and son were reunited. And he'd lost another family, but he had someone to carry over his tradition of his family. They lived together, they were roommates. And Yossi got married, he became a menahel, a principal of a Talmud Torah in Petach Tikva. And in the first Lebanon War in 1982, Yossi was drafted, and in his Jeep, it went over a landmine, and Yossi was killed. And I thought to myself, should I go be Menachem Avel? Should I go comfort Shmulik? I'm friendly with him. I don't even know if he knew my name. I debated, why should I intrude on his privacy? And in the end, I decided I would go. I walked into his apartment. In my life, I've never seen such sadness. He'd taken an area rug and folded it over. He was sitting on the floor, and he was bawling and crying, industrial sobs, crying and crying. What could I say? The walls were plastered with 2 types of pictures, photographs. Shmulik and his son Yossi, Yossi and Shmulik, and pictures of scenes of Israel. Obviously, the 2 great loves of his life, his son, and pictures of Israel. After 15 minutes, which felt like an eternity at least, I finally got up to leave. I didn't even say a word. I just heard him cry, and I didn't know what to do with myself. It was such sadness. I got up to leave, and I said the formula of consolation, Hamakom yanachem otchem b'toch shavletzion v'shalayim. May the God comfort you among the mortars of Zion and Jerusalem. And I'm walking out to leave, and he called me back, and he said, tell me, why is it that it says Hamakom, the place? That's God's name. There's so many usual names for God. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ribbono Shel Olam, Hashem Yitbarach. Why? Elokim, why Hamakom? And he answered his own question. After all I've gone through, losing my wife, my people, my town, the only consolation I have left is Hamakom, this place, the land of Israel. And for all of us, it should be a consolation, something to celebrate. We have our own land now. Thank you very much once again, Jack, and this wonderful community for inviting me. I hope this is the beginning of a relationship. And check out the podcast, Teller from Jerusalem. Chag Sameach. And the money. Baruch Tiyah. I'll let you.